What should the Baltimore Ravens do at the wide receiver position moving forward? We talk about that and more next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we return here with another episode of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Allstriker of Ravens Wire. We're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by Blue Nile. This Mother's Day, give mom something she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On Sports listeners get $50 off of $500. Use code Locked On at checkout. And we're back here. It is a midweek Wednesday edition of the show. We've been chugging along throughout this week, talking about draft recaps and the prospects the Ravens selected in the 2022 draft. I think they got a very, very nice 11-player draft class, and we'll be continuing to talk about that here today, but also answer your mailbag questions. So in the second and third segments, we'll answer your mailbag questions, talking about what the Ravens should do at the wide receiver position, how some of these new draft picks will be utilized on the team, and much more. In the first segment, though, I do want to talk about some Ravens news, notes, and quotes. There have been a couple of things that have kind of dropped over the last couple of days, including new jersey numbers that actually have a little bit of meaning to them if you really look deeply into which numbers were assigned. We can talk a little bit about Justin Houston as well. So a ton to talk about in this first segment as well. Before we dive into that content, though, if you're here with us on YouTube, you're finding us for the first time maybe, or you've been watching us on YouTube for a while, thank you for tuning in. If you are new and you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I greatly appreciate it if you would do so. And like the video, it does help out a ton. And we have a ton of great daily Ravens content here Monday through Friday every single weekday. So if you like daily Ravens content, be sure to stick around, subscribe to the channel, like the video. But in audio form, it's the same thing. Daily Ravens content, 5 days per week. And it's the same show in both audio and video form. So you're not missing out anything, whether you're watching or you're listening. I appreciate all the audio listeners as well. And also be sure to follow me on Twitter at KAllstriker34 and the Locked On Ravens account at Locked On Ravens. Let's dive into this content now. And let's start off with, let's do jersey numbers first, because that was something that did come out yesterday. The Ravens' entire rookie class, along with some veterans, getting new numbers now. The big ones being Kyle Hamilton and Tyler Linderbaum, the Ravens' 2 first-round selections. Kyle Hamilton gets to keep his college number at number 14, a number previously worn by Sammy Watkins in 2021. Kyle Hamilton gets it for 2022, and hopefully for the foreseeable future, as hopefully he'll be able to pan out into something really great in Baltimore. I feel like he will. Tyler Linderbaum will not be able to keep his college number. He wore 65 in college. That number belongs to Patrick McCary. He's making the switch to number 64. So that's a number that he will be wearing for the foreseeable future, hopefully, as well. But then you also have other players like David Ojabo wearing number 90, Demarion Williams wearing number 22, Travis Jones wearing number 98, James Shea actually switching from number 11 to number 3, and the number 11 is actually taken by Jordan Stout. But some of the key ones in there, and also a few others like Jalen Armour-Davis wearing number 5 and Dano Falele wearing number 77. But the key ones I want to focus in on here are 22, 90, 98, and I guess 3. We can talk about 3 a little bit too, because those are all numbers of really cherished veterans on this team who have been on the free agent market for a couple of months now. Obviously, number 22 last worn by Jimmy Smith, number 90 by Pernell McPhee, number 98 by Brandon Williams, and obviously number 3 by LJ Fort. Now, if they're giving these guys numbers out to other players, not a great sign as to them potentially coming back. Now, it seems like the writing has been on the wall for Brandon Williams ever since Calais Campbell was re-signed. I'd always said it was probably going to be one or the other with those two, and Calais Campbell ends up getting re-signed, which I think was the right decision. Brandon Williams, it seems like he's not going to be back in a Ravens uniform. Obviously, just because they gave the numbers out doesn't mean that there's a 100% chance they're not coming back, right? But there's something to it, I feel like, where you're not giving these guys numbers out if you at least are I'd say, confident that they're coming back. So I think the writing is a little bit on the wall for these guys. Obviously, Jimmy Smith has made it pretty clear that it's Ravens or bust for him. If the Ravens didn't want to bring him back, he would retire. That's what he has said. Who knows if he follows through on that, but he has been pretty adamant about it over the past couple of years. So I wouldn't be shocked if that's what ends up happening. Pernell McPhee is another player that a lot of people were kind of thinking, will he be back? Will he not be back? They have some need at the edge rusher position, especially with David Ojabo potentially not being able to play for the entire 2022 season. We'll see what his recovery looks like, but also with Tyus Bowser coming back from an Achilles injury, you just never really know. So was McPhee going to be the answer there? It, again, felt like it was going to be one of the two of Justin Houston or Pernell McPhee to go along with a couple of new edge rushers. And we'll talk about Justin Houston in a few minutes here, but it feels like that will be the option for them. And we'll talk about why. But yeah, Jimmy Smith, Pernell McPhee, Brandon Williams, even LJ Fort, who James Prochet switches over to the number 3. And again, it's like, why would you hand out the number if there's not a strong possibility that LJ Fort's not returning? You know, that's something where I personally really like LJ Fort. I think he would still be a valuable player to this team. And again, just because they gave out the number doesn't mean these guys won't be back in different numbers, let's say, right? But again, I think it does mean a little something. And if those 4, if their tenures are over in Baltimore, they have each done a lot in a lot of different ways. Obviously, Jimmy Smith being a very, very long tenured cornerback, one of the best defensive backs in franchise history, if I say so myself, a player that the stats don't really show up for him all the time, but you have to respect what he's been able to do on the field. And when he's been healthy, I know that the health has been a bit of a concern for him. And obviously he's not the best defensive back to ever grace the Baltimore secondary, but he has definitely established himself as one of the better defensive backs in franchise history. So he's done a ton for the franchise. Pernell McPhee coming back after leaving, and he made a mark for multiple years in Baltimore. Brandon Williams, obviously another really, really long tenured player on the defense, that if his time is up, you know, he did so many good things, a dominant run stuffer for years. So you have to look at all that and really appreciate what they've all done. And even LJ Fort coming in the middle of that 2019 season, providing a stable veteran presence. Again, it's not official till it's official, but it kind of maybe feels like it could be a little bit official. So if those 4 guys aren't back, I appreciate what they have done for the franchise for sure. But someone who feels like it is likely he'll be coming back is Justin Houston. And Field Yates actually reporting that the Ravens applied the UFA tender on outside linebacker Justin Houston. So what this actually means is that if Houston signs with a new team before July 22nd or the first day of training camp, whichever is later, they would count towards the compensatory pick formula. And if they don't sign by then, Baltimore has exclusive negotiating rights. So this is a move where it feels like the Ravens don't want to let Justin Houston necessarily get away. It feels like the reunion between Houston and the Ravens makes a lot of sense. And it's something I think on a cheap veteran contract, getting the services of Justin Houston, who I feel like has been underrated. Like his 2021 season, no, the stats were not mind-blowing, right? But I think he was very underrated in what he did on the field. And there's a study, I think it was, Justin Houston missed out on about 4 sacks by not being able to finish his tackles. And so he was getting pressure on the quarterback. Obviously, the sack total is not what you want to see, especially after what he's been doing for his entire NFL career. But I think in a role, and especially with David Ojabo and Tyus Bowser, those 2 injuries up in the air in terms of return dates, I think that'd be a very solid addition. Now, the actual tender for Justin Houston costs around $2.3 million. So if Houston does end up signing that tender, it would be a really good deal. 1 year, $2.5 million around. I would take that for Justin Houston for sure. Someone who can slot in with Odafe Owe. You have other guys in there who can also contribute. We saw a lot. Hopefully Jalen Ferguson can turn his career around and give the Ravens something there. The Ravens also probably banking a lot on Dalen Hayes too, to have a big second season after missing most of his rookie year with an injury. So I think Houston coming back, it makes a lot of sense. He knows the system will, I guess not the entire system, because obviously it's going to be a bit of a new one with Mike McDonald coming in, but he's been around the organization, knows the guys in the locker room, at least most of those guys. He knows what it's like to be a Raven, pretty much. You know, it's cheesy as it sounds. So for Houston, it makes sense that he would come back. I would expect that move to happen. Obviously, again, nothing's set in stone until it happens, but it feels more and more likely that move will happen. And if it does, hey, I'll be excited for it, because I personally really do like Justin Houston, his fit on this team, the veteran leadership he brings, and all the stuff that he was able to do for the Ravens in 2021. I think he'll be able to do a lot of that again in 2022 and just be overall just solid, I would say. But we'll head into our first break here on Locked On Ravens. Still a ton to talk about, though. When we get back, we'll be diving into the first batch of mailbag questions for today's show. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Still a ton to talk about on Locked On Ravens. But first, I do want to tell you a bit about Blue Nile. And if you want a statement piece or everyday subtle elegance, BlueNile.com has fine jewelry options for every mom. Shop high-quality classic diamond earrings, elegant tennis bracelets, or gemstone pendant necklaces. And you can mark Mother's Day with something enduring, a classic diamond stud earring set, elegant tennis bracelets, birthstone pendants, and so much more on BlueNile.com. So this Mother's Day, give mom something she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On Sports listeners get $50 off of $500. This podcast exclusive is only good through Mother's Day. Use code Locked On. That's code Locked On. Plus, every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com today. We're back here. Our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still hanging out with you again. Thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. If you're here with us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe, like the video in audio form, follow us, turn notifications on. I greatly appreciate everybody tuning in here today. But let's talk about your mailbag questions, talking about the wide receiver position, where some of these rookies will be utilized on the offense and more. And let's start off with the wide receiver position. And number one, we'll talk about a question here from Barrett King 89. Who asks, how do you see the Ravens addressing the wide receiver position? Is there a guy out of Landry, Fuller, Hilton you would like, or would you rather stick with what we got? And if so, who do you think will be our wide receiver 2 out of the young guys? So this is a question that I think has obviously shot up to the top of number one on a lot of people's minds right now in terms of where the Ravens will go at the wide receiver position. Obviously, the way that the Ravens have addressed the position in recent seasons, obviously taking 2 guys in 2019, 2 guys in 2020, 2 guys in 2021. Baltimore got rid of both of their 2019 receivers in a matter of about 2 weeks, right? Miles Boykin first, Marquise Brown second. I thought they were going to draft at least one guy even before Marquise Brown was traded. They draft none even after Marquise Brown was traded. So the question here from Barrett King 89, I think that they have to go out there and sign someone. I just feel like even if the Ravens keep 5 wide receivers, right? Let's say the Ravens keep 5 wide receivers, which I think for them is the minimum. I think 5 wide receivers is too little. 6 is kind of right in the range I feel like would be good, and 7 is probably a little bit too many. If they just keep 5 receivers, right now you're looking at Rashad Bateman, Devin Duvernay, Tylan Wallace, and James Prochet. Very, very talented receivers, right? Don't get me wrong. I have confidence those guys can all contribute in a big way in 2022. That's a very young group, a group that hasn't had a lot of snaps together, not a lot of snaps in general on the field. I think they just need a veteran presence in that locker room, in that room, to be able to go out in the field and maybe provide some veteran snaps. Now, my personal choice is Jarvis Landry. I think Jarvis Landry still has a ton to give. He's somebody who at this point does feel likely to go back to Cleveland, but if somehow he can make his way to Baltimore, you can play him in the slot, you can play him on the outside. He has positional versatility, super tough, has given the Ravens a ton of problems over recent seasons. We've seen how he can do a lot of different things on the field, has a drop issue here or there sometimes, but I feel like it's not really that noticeable. It'll pop up very rarely, although I know some people will argue it comes a little bit more often, which I can also see. But when you look at just the guys that are out there, Jarvis Landry is the clear number one. We're not in March anymore, right? We're not at the start of free agency. This is after draft free agency, which the Ravens have notoriously loved. And like, that's been good. They've found a lot of guys after cuts and after the draft where guys are signing for less and less and less, and they're still quality free agents. There are still quality free agents, right? But a lot of the guys still on the market, Barrett mentions, who is this, T.Y. Hilton and Will Fuller. Those are all guys that get injured a lot, right? Will Fuller is good for probably a good 6 missed games per season. T.Y. Hilton misses about a quarter of the year. I mean, these are players that when they're on the field, they give you production. Even talking about Julio Jones, who's still a free agent, Odell Beckham coming off the ACL. There are talented players, but just like what we saw with Sammy Watkins last year, if they're not on the field, they're not helping. And I think that's the key thing. They have to look at their ability, but their options are so thin that way in terms of what they can actually sign in free agency. Jarvis Landry, I think, is the best option for sure. He'll probably cost the most also, but I think at this point, you have to surround Lamar Jackson with as much talent as you can. I'm not saying the guys they have right now aren't talented. I really like those players, But what would it hurt to stack another guy on top of those guys and give the Ravens other options on offense to utilize these guys in a bunch of different ways and not overwork wide receivers, right? Even though this is a run first offense, and that is what it will probably be again in 2022, which is fine. I think we have seen that the Ravens can throw the football. We all know Lamar Jackson can throw the football effectively. He's a great thrower of the ball. He should let that arm be unleashed. The Ravens should let that arm be unleashed while also balancing out the offense with that dominant run game. So I think for the Ravens, they should sign somebody, or at least there have been rumors about Darius Slayton and potentially him coming over to Baltimore. I definitely wouldn't mind that option. Obviously, you look at the big guns like Deebo Samuel, DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, etc. That doesn't fit the Ravens MO. Like, I personally would like to see a move like that. I think that would be great, but it just doesn't fit what the Ravens do at that position. And honestly, in general, with trading heavy draft capital like that, they don't do that. They value the draft too much, I feel like, to do that. If they surprise me, they surprise me, and that's awesome. Like, I'm all for a surprise there. But I just think a more realistic option would be a T.Y. Hilton or a Will Fuller or even a Jarvis Landry, Julio Jones, etc. Good options, but you have to kind of build into your schedule. Hey, there's a possibility that these guys will miss a quarter of the year, and you got to plan for that. So it'll be interesting to see how the team addresses the position, but I do think they should address the position. If they don't, I think the wide receiver 2 is probably Devin Duvernay, just based off of snaps. He's shown a lot. I think the other 2 have shown flashes as well, but Duvernay is the most experienced. So I think if the roster stays as it is right now, I think Duvernay is that wide receiver 2, but obviously you have Mark Andrews, who's not a wide receiver, but you look at it and I feel like there are options to utilize all these guys in a lot of different ways. But again, adding talent to the room in the wide receiver position would not hurt whatsoever. Next, let's look at a question from Ofidafoy, who says, hello, Kevin. I heard likely will be used as a wide receiver. Does that mean he has to do a specific workout, speed training, lose weight? Again, thanks for the passion and wonderful work. Have a nice day. You have a nice day too. Thank you for the kind words. And in terms of Isaiah Likely, he's someone who could be used as a wide receiver. Isaiah Likely is a very versatile player. He has a very big frame, but he was a standout wide receiver in high school. He has the position of versatility, and he's somebody you can line up in the slot. You can line up on the outside if you want to. Line up in a traditional tight end role. You can put him at H-back. He has a specific role that he could play. Like, if you want to line him up in line the entire time, you can do it. But I think with the way that the Ravens want to utilize their pass catchers this year and just the lack of pure receivers they have right now, they're going to have to find creative ways to use their tight ends. And at this point, and obviously this is subject to change, I feel like the Ravens will keep 4 tight ends on their roster. I feel like Nick Boyle is too valuable when healthy, obviously, and when healthy is the key there. But I think what you can do is if you want to use Likely in the slot or on the outside, I don't necessarily think he has to do any specific training. I'm sure he'll be working with Keith Williams a little bit throughout the summer and figuring out the best role for him. And right now the Ravens are still trying to, they have ideas of what they want to do, but before they actually get on the practice field, it's more thinking. And then when you get to training camp and OTAs and everything, the preseason, that's when you experiment. You can figure out where guys fit in best. And again, if the Ravens don't adjust the position, I think Isaiah Likely is a player that you can use in a lot of different positions. So in terms of actual training, I'm sure that if the Ravens want to use him in a more versatile role, they'll ask him to kind of be prepared for that. But in terms of speed training and losing weight and all that, I don't think he has to necessarily sacrifice his frame to play wide receiver. I think it's actually more of a matchup nightmare if he doesn't necessarily slim down to 220 or whatever a big wide receiver would be. But I feel like for Likely, there's a lot of options to use him in this offense. And that moves us to our next question from Ravens fan, who says, how does Likely get utilized in this offense for the upcoming year? Do we really need a top-level receiver to complement Bateman? And yeah, so in terms of Likely, again, kind of what I talked about, I think that he can be used in a ton of different roles, and they drafted him for that reason because obviously the Peter King article came out about how the Ravens wanted Calvin Austin. The Steelers took him 1 pick before the Ravens, and then the Ravens pivoted, obviously, to Isaiah Likely at 139. So I think they view him as a hybrid tight end wide receiver who will probably play both in 2022. Now, what will the actual snap splits look like? I'm not sure yet. As we get closer, I'll probably have a better number on that, but I anticipate him still playing a bit more tight end. But again, that's assuming the Ravens bring in somebody at wide receiver. If they don't, they're going to have to find ways to utilize those guys. And I think Likely, again, could be an option for them a lot at wide receiver in 2022. And then do we really need a top receiver to complement Bateman? I mean, do they need one? No, but would it be nice to have one? Yeah. I think that, look, the Ravens offense can be successful without a top flight wide receiver like a Deebo Samuel or DK Metcalf or whoever. But would it take it over the top? Yeah, it would absolutely take it over the top. We've seen Lamar Jackson win MVPs with Seth Roberts and Willie Snead and those guys. Again, no shade to any of those guys, but again, as I've said, they're not a DK Metcalf or Stephon Diggs or AJ Brown or DeAndre Hopkins or Devontae Adams, right? Lamar Jackson has done amazing things with a wide receiver core that when you look at other teams around the league has not been up to snuff with those. So you don't have to necessarily have that to have Lamar Jackson be great, but I feel like they should provide him with an option, right? I mean, obviously it depends on the contract, depends on the draft capital you have to give up. But even if it's signing a Jarvis Landry, that is providing another option, a veteran option at that, outside of no one in that wide receiver room because they don't have a veteran in that wide receiver room right now. I think it'd be nice for them to do that. So even if it's not a star top 10 wide receiver that they trade for and give up all this draft capital for, I still think signing a guy like Jarvis Landry at the very low end of that, Julio Jones, assuming he can stay healthy at this point. I mean, I think that the Ravens should do that for their quarterback because, again, it adds an element to Mark Andrews and Rashad Bateman and Devin Duvernay and Tylan Wallace and James Prochet that you just wouldn't have. I mean, these veteran receivers know how to come back for the football, know how to sit down in zones, help the quarterback out when he's in trouble. I'm not saying the other guys don't. Like Mark Andrews clearly knows how to do that. We've seen him do it. Rashad Bateman has been learning that at the NFL level, and he knows how to do it as well. All these guys do, but a veteran just has a feel for the game. He knows how to match up against corners across the league who he's matched up against time and time again. So there's an added benefit to having a veteran. And no matter who it is, I mean, there's a list of guys I'd be comfortable with on the Ravens who are still on the free agent market right now. But my choice is Jarvis Landry. Obviously, a top flight guy would be great, but again, it doesn't fit what they do. So I'm not banking on them bringing in a veteran through trade where they have to give up 2 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks, etc. Finally, before we head into our final break, we'll look at a question from Gunny Ravens, who asks, in your opinion, what did not drafting a wide receiver or linebacker tell you about the Ravens roster? Also, if you could, what reasonable additions would you make to upgrade those 2 positions, if any? So what did not drafting a wide receiver or linebacker tell me about the Ravens roster? Well, I think wide receiver was more they just didn't like the class. Eric DeCosta talked about that, how the wide receiver class outside of the first couple guys they really weren't as high on as I feel like other teams were. And it's really interesting to think about if that run of wide receivers didn't happen, and I know Spencer Schultz has talked about this before, would the Ravens have taken Kyle Hamilton? Personally, I would have, but we saw the Titans trade away A.J. Brown and take Treylon Burks to be kind of that one-for-one replacement. I think not drafting a wide receiver tells me less about the Ravens roster than it does the linebacker position. I think the Ravens are pretty confident in their linebackers right now, especially with the addition of Kyle Hamilton. The addition of Hamilton, I feel like, reduces the need for a pure inside linebacker because if Chuck Clark does stay, and right now we don't really know if he's going to stay or not, but if he's still on the roster, you can use him up in the box. You can also use Kyle Hamilton in the box. You don't have to have 2 inside linebackers on the field at the same time every single snap, which I think is great. So I think the Ravens, they signed, 3-4 undrafted free agent linebackers. So maybe one of those guys can make it, but they still have Malik Harrison. Obviously, Josh Bynes came back, Christian Welch. So you have options there, but I think the need for linebacker was not eliminated, but I think was made less of a need with the addition of Kyle Hamilton. But yeah, going back to wide receiver, I just feel like that was more the Ravens didn't like the class and they would have liked to take a couple guys in X round or Y round, but it just didn't fall the way they wanted to. And I feel like they will still be looking on the market for a guy, but they do have confidence in the guys they have. They've expressed that. I think that those guys all have potential to be great, but again, adding more to that would be, I think, on my wish list for the remainder of the offseason for that. And then if I could, what additions would I make to upgrade those 2 positions, if any? Wide receiver, yeah, Jarvis Landry, Julio Jones, T.Y. Hilton, Odell Beckham. Those are some of the names. I mean, again, pretty injury-prone names, all things considered, but you got to work with what's out there. I think they still have talent. They just have to stay on the field. Will Fuller's another option there as well. Linebacker, not a ton out there I would do. I feel like, again, with the 3 safeties, this could be a different conversation if the Ravens trade Chuck Clark, but for right now, as the roster is, I wouldn't make an addition. I feel like you can use the safety looks like linebackers and kind of have that versatility there. And maybe an inside linebacker on undrafted free agent make some noise. So interesting thoughts about the roster as a whole, and interesting to think about as well, because there are still so many questions to answer during the offseason. Just because the draft is over doesn't mean that the NFL offseason ends. There's still a lot to talk about throughout the rest of the offseason. We'll head into our final break here, though. I'll make it back. We'll be rounding out the episode with more mailbag questions, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Still a ton to talk about on Locked On Ravens. But first, let me tell you a bit about Built Bar. And summer's coming, and with summer, you're going to need some food on the go. Built Bars are the perfect snacks to take with you on family vacations. You can throw them in your bag or in your kids' backpacks, and you also have to make sure that everyone has a Built Bar so you're fueled for your summer adventure. And the best part about Built Bars is they're healthy and delicious. No more sacrificing delicious food for health. All Built Bars and the puffs as well are covered in 100% real chocolate. That means a Built Bar you can eat as healthy as ever and actually enjoy doing it. Built Bar has a ton of great flavors like banana cream pie and even churro. They contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Candy bars usually have around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. So it's a good deal health-wise for Built Bars. So go to Built.com to get all your favorites like banana cream pie, raspberry double chocolate, and so many more. My favorite's mint brownie, so you have to check that out as well. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, get 50% off your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. We're back here, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still here with you. And go check out Locked On NFL. Is a lot of different hosts throughout the network are hosting that show every single weekday. We have a lot of different analysis, a lot of different expert opinions there. So thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen, but go make your second listen Locked On NFL. Let's run out the segment or this episode with another segment of mailbag questions. And we'll first dive into a question from DH, who says, dude, some interesting names out there just got declined 5th-year options. Any chance we snag 1 or 2? Devin Bush, Josh Jacobs. And obviously this depends on how they perform during this upcoming season. The 5th-year option being declined means that for next year, they'll be a free agent. So that doesn't mean they're all automatically free agents now. But I feel like Devin Bush is a player. There is talent there. The off-field stuff kind of concerns me a little bit in terms of just like what he's said on social media at times, and obviously some of that stuff as well. So I don't know. That'll be an interesting option. I don't think the Ravens necessarily could look at Devin Bush. They could if he has a great season, but again, some of the things he tweeted out last offseason were pretty interesting, to say the very least. And Josh Jacobs, potentially. I mean, if the Ravens want to go for a veteran running back, Jacobs, I think the deal with Jacobs would be he couldn't necessarily take a lot of the cap space in Baltimore, right? He would have to sign a pretty team-friendly deal, and I don't know if Jacobs would sign that. Maybe with a down season that could happen, but I feel like that he will still be able to find a decent contract elsewhere. So out of those two names, not really. Maybe Jonathan Abram, but again, the safety position is just so beefed up for the Ravens. They don't even need that really. So I don't know. Right now, the 5th-year option guy is not super appealing to me, but that could obviously change with great years in 2022. So we'll end up seeing about that. But it is interesting to mention those guys because this is the time where guys are getting their 5th-year options declined, and it'll be key for the free agent market next season and next off season. Next, we'll look at a question from Shane Carty, who says, who do you think the biggest deal was for the Ravens and why? Also, who do you see having the biggest impact for the franchise long-term? Also, love listening to your podcast every day, KO. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you, Shane. I appreciate that a lot. I think for the Ravens, the biggest steal of the draft, there are so many, obviously. I think it's Travis Jones. I think it's going to be Travis Jones here. Obviously, the popular pick will be Kyle Hamilton. I don't want to double down, though, in my answer to the question because the second person would be Kyle Hamilton, and I'll explain why. But Jones is a player we saw sneak into the first round, certain mock drafts, mid-second round guy for the most part. I had him in the early to mid-second round. He's a very dominant player in the interior defensive line class, like that mid-round, like second, third, fourth round interior defensive line class, very deep. But I think Travis Jones, one of the best of the bunch, and someone who can be part of the future at defensive line. The Ravens obviously taking no defensive linemen in 2021 in that draft, and that shocked me a little bit. So they get a player like Travis Jones who can learn from Calais Campbell, learn some of the veterans, I think establish a role for himself early on. And then once Campbell departs and leaves the organization and leaves the team, and Derek Wolfe and Michael Pierce, etc., you now have, I think, a pretty good foundation with Travis Jones, Justin Madubuike, and Broderick Washington. Still some more work to be done there, obviously, but I feel like that's pretty good, all things considered. And then also, I feel like he can play alongside these guys this season, and that also is key because the Ravens have struggled to generate interior pass rush over the past a long time. So I'm hopeful that you'll be able to do that at the NFL level effectively. So I like Travis Jones a lot. Second part of the question here: who do you see having the biggest impact for the franchise long term? This is Kyle Hamilton. Kyle Hamilton is a player that I think will be in Baltimore for a very long time. One of the best safety prospects to come out in years, and that's pretty high praise. Now we'll see how he actually turns out in the NFL, but I feel like for Kyle Hamilton, he's a player that will do a lot of great things for this organization for a very long time, and that to me is the player that I think will have the biggest long-term impact for the team just because of how absolutely incredible he is on the field. And yeah, so Hamilton is my pick. Finally, though, we will look at a question from @Twinenberg who says, Chuck Clark, radio bobbleheads have talked of possibly trading him. What do you see as pros/cons? Could this come to fruition? For the record, I am pro keep Chuck. So yeah, I've never heard radio bobbleheads before. Interesting term. But in terms of Chuck Clark, yeah, I think it's 50-50 on whether he stays or whether he goes. Jess Rebeck at The Athletic tweeted out, I think it was a couple days ago, that Clark has been unhappy with some of the things that have unfolded this offseason. And so whether that is contractually related or personnel related, I'm not entirely sure. It might be more contractually, but we'll figure that out, or maybe we won't. But eventually, that situation has to come and be resolved. And if Chuck Clark is off the team, the Ravens could get a decently sized package for him, team-friendly contract, someone who is a very solid contributor. But in terms of pros for the team, I mean, they're able to free up some linebacker snaps. They don't have a logjam at safety. I mean, to me, I think there are more cons than pros. At this stage, I just think Clark is a very important part of the defense. He's like a glue guy. He wears the green dot. You have to move that green dot around. I think there are more cons than pros in this situation. Again, I think it's more 50-50. It does come to fruition. I am also on team keep Chuck Clark. But again, if Clark isn't happy with his contract, or if Clark isn't happy with having to give up snaps to somebody, I mean, safety wasn't a need coming into the draft. Taking Hamilton was a pure best player available pick. I agree with the pick, but you have to look at it as, how does it impact other players on the roster, right? How does taking two tight ends impact Nick Boyle or Patrick Ricard? How does taking a punter impact Sam Cook, right? All these different players that weren't drafted and have been on the team actually have some impact from these draft selections. So we'll see how it ends up working out for Chuck Clark. I hope he stays. I think it'd be good if he was able to just be an absolute menace in the back end and be a great, great player for them. But I think for the Ravens, they might have to look to move him because of just certain circumstances, like they had to with Marquise Brown, stuff that they necessarily don't have 100% control over. So I think it's just a matter of what Chuck Clark wants, and the Ravens have been very accommodating with moving players who want to be moved. So if he does want to be moved, I think we could see him be moved. But for me, I am definitely team keep Chuck Clark. I hope he does stay a member of the organization in 2022. But that's all I have here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in. When we get back here tomorrow, we'll be diving into more Ravens talk. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you tomorrow.